Okay, so today we're going to go over a brief history of clay. For your next assignment, you're going to look at some of these next 16 slides, pick out a time period that had some sort of significant contribution to the way we work with clay today, and recreate a piece that you pick. You'll also be telling us about that time period, why it was important, in a little bit more detail than you'll hear me talking about it today. So, as far back as 35,000 years ago, um, man sculpted with clay. Um, these little fertility figures, or sometimes animals, we think, were made for ritual purposes, for things like good luck, so that you would be lucky enough to have children, which is why women were often depicted in the little figures, or that you would be successful in, say, the hunt. They weren't always fired. Sometimes they were carved stone as well. But in Japan, as far back as 9,500 BC, or over 11,000 years ago, we find remnants of fired clay, so that man had actually mastered the process by then. 7,000 in the Middle East, 6,000 in South America, 3,000, I'm sorry, 7,000 in China, 6,000 in the Middle East. And then, of course, in other parts of the world as well. So what we see here are some fertility figures. Female reproductive parts are, in fact, emphasized because of their magical ability to provide children for the tribe, the family, and that sort of thing. The most famous of these is this one. It's called Venus of Willendorf. It's small. It'll fit in your hand. And it's one of the oldest known symbols of man, we'll just say, at this point in time. Around 2700 BCE, we had the first self-glazing clay, or what we might refer to as this first glaze. It's called Egyptian paste or Egyptian faience, and here we see a hippo. Of course, the hippo was the king of the river. So in Egypt, that would be a symbol of power, and we'll see that throughout the course of history as well here. Around the same time, the rest of African ceramics was being developed as well. And we see here a pot from, I believe, Togo. And they continue to make these wonderful coil vessels that have textures and are kind of like part sculpture, part utilitarian vessel. As far back as 2500, we know that the Chinese were developing some kind of a throwing mechanism. Sometimes they used two stones that fit together, so you could spin the stone and it would be heavy enough to maintain its momentum. Or in this case, this little illustration could be, two people working together, one spinning the clay while the other person works on the clay itself. As far back as 700 BC, we had important pottery being made in Greece. The Grecians then influenced the Romans some 1,000 years later, and they copied their pots. They had a number of different shapes that they would make that were sort of standardized classical shapes. Like this would be, I believe, an amphora, but it had a specific purpose. And there was other pots that had specific purposes, things that were used for storing oils, things that were used for serving wine, things that were used for storing grain. And each one had a specific shape and size. They handcrafted them and then hand painted them with a black slip. The earliest figures wear was called black figureware because, as you can see here, the figure is painted with the black slip. The color of the red that surrounds that figure is the actual color of their clay. Then they shifted some, 100 years later to painting around the figures, and that's referred to as red figure technique or red figure wear. So we have the same sort of scene playing out here. These are two famous, like, kings or gods or something like that who are playing a game of chess, and it's like about the Peloponnesian Wars. We'd have to talk to Atwood or Burgess about that to get a better idea. But black figure wear or red figure wear. Around 200 in China, one of the most significant achievements in ceramic art was the creation and burial of these terracotta warriors, creating an army. They've unearthed about 7,000 and closing in on about 8,000 now, but they have no idea how many there actually were. But this burial site for Emperor Qin had them lined up in order to protect him. Of course, the figures had pieces that were sort of standardized, but then there were parts that were personalized as well. Like they have individual faces. If you look just right here, you can see the hairstyles are different, the mustaches are different, even the face shape was different, even though parts of them look very much the same. Incredible. As we turn from the before Common Era to Common Era time, in Korea during a Silla period, and I hope I'm saying that right, we had the artists discovering the glazing possibilities of ash. When the ash would burn up from their wood source or their heat source and hit the sides of the pot, they'd get this sort of natural glaze. So they started experimenting with using ash to make other glazes. And we still use some of the recipes based on the kinds of things that they were doing as far back as the change in time. These, I believe, are lanterns or oil burning lanterns or cups that you could make with coils or on the wheel. Oh, I need to click here to move on. There we go. Meanwhile, in South America, the Mochica people depicted just about every aspect of their life using clay. They made these wonderful sculptural vessels that were sometimes portraits, sometimes people, in this case, a fish. And they had a very unique feature that we'll talk about later as well, this handle that goes around, it's hollow, and then goes up. It's called a stirrup handle, and I'll talk a little bit more about that probably in class. But that handle was maybe their way of transporting many things at the same time on, say, like a pole. It also might have helped with evaporation. The water would not evaporate out of there, but would fall back in to the body of the vessel itself. And this is unique to South America, just like the wedding vase was unique to North America and the United States. This design was seen no place else in the world. It's called the stirrup handle. In China during this time period, we had these cool Hanua figures and Jomon pottery. That's another one that you might want to take a look at. We think that they might have been grave markers, but they also could have been put by graves to prevent erosion. Some of them get quite intricate. In fact, there are conspiracy theory people out there who think that they might depict aliens. But I've always found them kind of charming, and this might be the kind of thing that you think, okay, if I can't make a Ming vase, but I could maybe make that. Tang pottery, Tang Dynasty pottery is unbelievably realistic for the time period. They used molds to streamline the process for themselves so that they didn't have to recreate everything. And they did a lot of work with lead-based glazes so they could get brighter yellows, greens, reds, blues than people who weren't using lead-based glazes. And of course, we don't really use lead-based glazes anymore. This is kind of a funny one, but if you've ever looked at like the horses outside of P.F. Chang's, that would be an example of Tang pottery or a imitation thereof. Meanwhile, as we're starting to work our way forward in time, in Korea, the Koryo dynasty pottery is known as some of the finest pottery that's ever been made. As a matter of fact, the Chinese, during this time period, went into Korea and kidnapped some of their potters and brought them back to China so that they could learn how to make things like this color glaze, which is called a celadon glaze for its green color. It can sometimes even be kind of like a deeper green to blue. This one crackles a little bit, but there are many different kinds of celadon. They also invented this technique called mashimo, which is just the opposite of sgraffito. In sgraffito, you carve a way to make lines through a slip. in Mishima, you carve and then fill those lines with a slip and then sand off the surface to reveal the imagery. We don't see that in this piece, but they started to do that. Mishima is actually the Japanese word that describes the process. There's a different word in Korean. I need to put that in here next time. Back to South America, where some of my favorite pottery comes from. This is an example of a Chimu piece, who also developed these stirrup handles, and they pushed it even further so that we think that maybe some of the noise of the water being transported might have encouraged them to like use it as a musical instrument. Like a percussion instrument almost. But they went a step further and started working on the interior of the piece to turn them into actually whistling pots so that you could like blow into it and it would play music. So you can kind of see on the front of this one how it's got a couple of little different holes as well as that kind of modified stirrup handle there. So you could blow in here and they actually made whistles and they would play these instruments. The Ming Dynasty is one of the most famous time periods during the development of work in China. It is known for its beautiful white porcelain walls. They worked with this clay called porcelain that fired at really high temperatures. And then they also developed glazes from something called cobalt, and that cobalt made that blue um, uh, color that you see the birds painted in on there. So they were skilled at throwing. They could throw these things up to 3 millimeters thin, which made them sometimes almost translucent, where you could see light through the clay itself. And then expert technicians in terms of rendering. So you see beautiful scenes and dragons and birds and images from nature in Ming pottery. You, of course, can always remember Ming pottery because it's white walls with blue decoration. And we play Wyoming every year in sports, and they wear white and blue uniforms. So it's easy to remember. White and blue, it's Ming. 1400 in Germany, they developed salt-fired pottery. And what that meant is they fired their pottery, and at the end, before they started cooling the kiln, they'd throw in salt, and the salt would mix with the atmosphere and hit the sides of pots and create a really strong self-glazing technique. So you might have seen some of these German jugs or cups because we have a strong German heritage here in Cincinnati. And they became very popular in Europe during this time period because of their strength and their utility. During the turn of the century, when the world was starting to become an industrialized place and pottery was being made by corporations instead of people, there was always, and there always will be, people who long for the good old days, and they start to try to make the kind of work that you've seen before or has been done by hand for a long time. One of the most famous of these was Rookwood pottery right here in Cincinnati, although there are many heroes from this age who brought techniques from China or Japan back to the United States or England. So the arts and craft movement in the United States has many traditional techniques being rekindled during the turn of the century. Oh, can I click over here? And as we move a little bit closer to the future, all of this pottery that I showed you seems like it was more kind of a utilitarian thing, more like craft. And then in 1946, Pablo Picasso, who was a very famous artist at that point in time already, decided that instead of painting on canvases, he wanted to paint on pots. And so with assistance from ceramic artists who would make the pots for him, he would then paint and decorate them, kind of like we did with our Southwest pots. And people started to see ceramics in a different way. Instead of thinking of it just as craft or some place to put flowers or something that you would drink out of, they started to see it as a legitimate art form. And that's kind of how people continue to look at it today. Now, it wasn't just Picasso, but he certainly was important. And he certainly made some really cool pieces, although I always think it's funny that I know that this is a Picasso vase, but I have no idea who made it. I know it wasn't Picasso. He just painted it. That's kind of interesting to me. Later into the 20th century, there was a movement of artists who worked with ceramics out in California. They were called themselves the funk art movement, which I think is kind of funny. Their work is often playful and kind of funny or disturbing or challenging. This is a piece by Robert Arneson where he's balancing these bricks on his head. I have to look a little closer and see what the bricks say, probably to get the joke, but the expression on his face tells us that he didn't put them there himself, that it looks like it kind of hurts. So there's something kind of funny about his work. So if you like things that make you smile, you might want to look at funk art from the United States. And of course, all of these things continue today. There are people making great pots in Africa. There are people making great pots in Europe and the Middle East and all over the place. So don't feel like you have to just limit your search to these 15 slides. But if you are going off of these 15 slides and you want to do something else, let me see it first so that we're picking an appropriate challenge for you, one, and we aren't picking something that's kind of cheesy or that's been done or that's too easy. You want a good challenge. You don't want to be making something that is beneath you at this point. You want to be pushing yourself. All right, so I am going to escape out of this and stop sharing. And I look forward to seeing what you pick.